Hi everybody, thanks for being here. I am mic free today, so I'm going to try to speak up. And please bear with us. I'm hoping I can make that do the thing I want it to do. So if we have a little bit of technical snags, please bear with me. So the title of my talk today is called What Now? Gender Justice and the LGBTQ Movement After Marriage. As the title of the talk indicates, I'm probably going to be asking more questions today than I'll be giving you answers about anything. But what really happened was I agreed to give this talk a while back, and the more I thought about the what now question, which is about the future, the more I started thinking about the past. And so I found myself drawn back to a certain moment in queer history that I think we haven't fully dealt with. And I think that has really determined why we have the set of conditions we have right now. So you might not have expected this talk to be mostly about the AIDS crisis, but that's what it's going to be about, as something that we don't really reckon with in our national politics at all. It's actually kind of timely. Does anyone know what happened today with HIV in the media? Anyone want to? Charlie Sheen, right? Charlie Sheen came out as positive. And in my social media, I don't know about yours, but already we're seeing tons of really negative stuff directed at him. So we know that we haven't done the work we need to do about HIV in our culture. Also, a lot of the pushback against that negativity has been this claim that there's no more crisis, there's no more crisis. We just give people information about how you can become undetectable and PrEP and all this stuff. And that's a real denial in many ways of the fact that we have very high seroconversion rates in the US, even today, higher in New York City than in West Africa, actually. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about trans politics and the AIDS crisis today, and also marriage and how that relates to these two issues. So to begin, I want you to consider two things, a seeming paradox that will hopefully become less so as I speak to you today. In June 2015, the United States Supreme Court found in the Obergefell v. Hodges case a constitutional right to marriage equality, which has been the centralized goal of the LGBT movement for the past 20 years. Many of you are probably aware of this achievement, which has been widely celebrated as the accomplishment of gay equality in our culture. In 2015, the United States also experienced the highest rate of transgender murders since the data began to be recorded 10 years ago. Every year on November 20th, trans community members and their supporters gather together for Transgender Day of Remembrance to read out the names and remember these people who have been killed. This year's list here in the United States is the longest it's ever been. 22 murders instead of last year's 12. Nearly a 100% increase. Two of these murders, of Amber Monroe and Ashton O'Hara, happened in Detroit, Michigan, where there have been so many unsolved killings of transgender women over the past few years that local activists are convinced it is the work of a serial killer or killers. So we're living in a very strange moment. We're being told by the media, by politicians, even by gay rights leaders themselves, that LGBTQ people are experiencing progress and equality, that we've reached a tipping point, and that it gets better. So how do we explain this rising rate of violent eradication of transgender bodies in a society that supposedly increasingly accepts LGBTQ people and that grants us rights? As we move forward today, please try to hold these two things, this recognition of some bodies and the destruction of others, in your minds. Let's talk about Houston. On November 4th, 2015, the first major test of LGBTQ rights politics since Obergefell, the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, or HERO, went down in flames. The law, which had been passed by the city's mayor and then challenged in a public referendum, would have established anti-discrimination protections for 15 separate classes of minority identities, including for sexual orientation and gender identity. Of all the protections included, the one for gender identity was targeted as going, quote, too far, and framed by opponents as allowing men to enter women's restrooms. The national LGBT organizations were helpless against this right-wing strategy, despite calls from local activists to do better outreach to communities of color and to counter the transphobic campaign. And what I want to show you is one of the ads from this campaign, so bear with me here.
Houston's Proposition 1 bathroom ordinance. What does it mean to you? Any man at any time could enter a woman's bathroom simply by claiming to be a woman that day. No one is exempt. Even registered sex offenders could follow women or young girls into the bathroom, and if a business tried to stop them, they'd be fined. Protect women's privacy. Prevent danger. Vote no on the Proposition 1 bathroom ordinance. It goes too far.
That was a very effective ad, and what we saw was that it was used to really split people along lines of minoritization. So some people who were interviewed said, well, I'm a woman, and I would like protections for gender, but this aspect of the law makes all the other aspects, the racial protections, the protections for religion, not worth it. So rather than allow protections for gender identity to pass, Houston residents voted down the entire HERO law, which also included protections for race, ethnicity, and religion. Houston was and remains today the largest U.S. city with no anti-discrimination protections for sexual orientation or gender identity in employment, housing, or public accommodations. After achieving marriage finally by a federal judicial ruling, and with 31 states under the control of conservative governors, we might ask, where do we go politically from here? Having invested ourselves in the political project of marriage equality, and yet surrounded by a sharply increasing wealth divide, astronomical rates of incarceration, and a rising tide of anti-trans and anti-queer violence, we might be asking, what now? For those of us who have been thinking critically about the shortcomings and divisive effects of marriage equality as a movement goal for years, these murders and the Houston outcome are no surprise. Queer and trans activists and thinkers who question marriage have been trying to alert the mainstream movement to this danger for decades. The failure of gay politics to achieve downwardly distributive measures, such as employment or housing protections, or the right to public accommodations or to health care, has been the direct effect of investments in marriage that have ignored the institution's upwardly distributive structure. Marriage, as Kate Bornstein points out, is a privileging institution, one that confers extra rights and additional financial security to those who best reflect the middle-class, heterosexual norms of American culture. Houston was an especially pernicious example of the divisive legacy of marriage equality as a movement goal, which had been pursued to the near total exclusion of issues facing the most disadvantaged LGBTQ people, including trans people of color. That the HERO ordinance was defeated by popular vote through the mobilization of virulently transphobic rhetoric is not a new evolution in the strategy of movement conservatives, as has been claimed. Instead, what the Houston defeat illustrates is the continuity of anti-trans rhetorics that surfaced in the mid-1970s and that marriage equality has been entirely useless in resisting. Now, let me be honest. I used to be one of those people who supported marriage equality. Yes, me too. When I first encountered the idea in college in the 1990s, I refused to write a position paper against gay marriage that had been assigned to me in my logic class. I was very fired up about that. I was like, I will not write this paper. And thinking back, this was part of my political awakening as a young American. It's really my first real moment of actively refusing to participate in institutional homophobia. I think a whole generation of us had that experience of like, wait a minute, this isn't okay, that people are saying we can't have marriage. The suggestion that we should illegalize gay marriage, which until then I would argue much of the country, had never even considered as an idea at all, had the effect of politicizing me in the opposite direction. Yes, I had an HRC sticker on my first car. Yes, I supported marriage wholeheartedly as a solution to gay inequality. And for nearly a decade, I encountered no one who warned me about the pitfalls of such thinking. It turns out that this was because most of the people who might have warned me were dead from a government-sanctioned plague. Then, two things happened. I took Professor Tim Dean's graduate queer theory course at the University at Buffalo, in which I was exposed to Michael Warner's 1999 book, The Trouble with Normal. This single book gave me access to the radical queer perspectives against marriage as a privileging, privatizing, and assimilative institution that I had not been able to encounter elsewhere. This is a great book. You should read it. The other thing that happened is that I realized I was transgender. As I became involved in transgender communities and their politics, I gained additional insight into how, after gay liberation, the LGBTQ movement had shifted to deprioritize gender nonconforming populations and centralize the concerns of cisgender white gay men and lesbians. Trans people are highly aware that the mainstream LGBT rights movement has done little to nothing on our issues for 40 years. The critiques that Warner's book makes, I realized, were not simply the product of queer theory or the academy. They were present and sharply articulated in trans communities as well. I have another admission to make. I myself am married. You're probably thinking, what a hypocrite, right? But here's the thing. As a trans person, I was never invested in the narrative that marriage would solve all my problems, or that it ensures me any particular kind of privilege, or that it should be the central goal of the LGBTQ movement. Trans people are highly aware that marriage is a flimsy protection against the state's compulsory gender system and its hetero and cisnormative definitions of family. There are many trans people whose marriages have been dissolved by the state for gender fraud, and whose spousal inheritances have been denied because their marriages were challenged as not real by biological relatives of their dead spouses. In a recent panel at this year's National American Studies Association conference titled "The Miseries of Marriage, What Do Queers Lose When We Win?", transgender theorist Susan Stryker pointed out that trans people have had something akin to same-sex marriage since the 1960s. And this is true. Think about it. A lesbian transgender woman who doesn't change her gender marker from male to female has a legal right to marry her wife. Same-sex marriage, okay? And Stryker says, well, it's kind of ironic that gay people didn't come knocking on our door and say, you guys have this thing, how do we get it? That was never a priority in terms of how gay people went around about trying to organize for marriage. They didn't go ask trans people, how are you getting away with this? So this hasn't meant that trans people, even though we've been getting gay married for decades, it doesn't mean that we have achieved equality, normalcy, or even realness as citizens. And what I'm going to try to play for you right now is a clip of Susan explaining this a bit. I'm hoping the audio will work. It might not. Super quiet, right?
More theoretical than actual, is that marriage is an act that usually secures privilege in terms set by the dominant culture, and doing transgender, whether or not you are being transgender, is not an act that increases your privilege vis-a-vis state and society. The presence of transgender people in marriage actually renders visible the vulnerability that many kinds of non-normative people have to having whatever privileges they manage to acquire or to have conferred upon them stripped away from them because they are deemed to be the wrong kind of person to exercise or hold that particular privilege. One of the more notorious recent cases of the invalidation of the marriage of a trans person was Littleton v. Prang, 1999. Christine Lee Littleton was assigned male at birth in San Antonio, Texas in 1952. She started living socially as a woman at age 15, medically transitioned through surgery and hormones at age 18 in 1980, and had all of her identity documentation changed at that time. She met and married Jonathan Littleton in Kentucky in the early 1990s, after which the couple relocated to Texas. Upon Jonathan's untimely death a few years later, Christine sued his doctor, Mark Prang, for malpractice. After a protracted legal battle, the Fourth Federal Court of Appeals ruled that legal sex in Texas was determined by chromosomes, that sex was inalterable, that even though the Littleton marriage had been legally entered into in another state, it was invalid in Texas under Texas law, and that as a legal stranger to her supposed husband, Christine had no legal standing to sue Prang for malpractice, and that the case was thus dismissed. So, takeaway point, marriage secures nothing for you, even if you can get it, even if it looks heterosexual and gender normative, if you are not the right kind of person deemed eligible to have it. I just want to say one more thing before I close here. Looking on the website of that really strong advocate for transgender rights, the Human Rights Campaign. This resource page that was written before the Supreme Court decisions, it's called Transgender People and Marriage, the Importance of Legal Planning. And it's like, it is such a great document that says how little marriage actually gets you. It says, if it is critical that transgender people who are married become aware of their potential legal vulnerability and take steps to protect themselves as much as possible. As an initial matter, transgender people who are married should certainly act accordingly. At the same time, however, it is important to create a safety net in the event that the validity of your marriage is challenged. At a minimum, a transgender person who is married should have a last will for both spouses, financial and medical powers of attorney, a written personal relationship agreement including a detailed account of each spouse's rights and responsibilities with regard to finances, property, support, children, and any other issue that are important to the couple. The agreement should include an acknowledgement that the non-transgender partner is aware that his or her spouse is transgender to avoid any later claims of fraud or deception. Ideally, the couple should draft these documents with the assistance of an attorney and supplement them with any other legal planning documents that are appropriate to their specific circumstances. With those basic documents in place, transgender people who are married can at least ensure that the spouses can inherit each other's estates and retain control over their finances and medical decisions, even if the validity of the marriage is challenged. So the takeaway point for all of that for me is like, what does marriage get you? If you're the wrong kind of person to have a marriage, it gets you nothing.
Okay, so that was really quiet, and I apologize about that. But what Stryker's really talking about there is that because the state still has control over who gets to be male and female, simply winning marriage rights does not necessarily mean the state can't come challenge the sanctity or security of your legal relationships to other people. So what trans people have experienced over time is that even though we have entered into legal marriages, those marriages can be challenged very easily by people claiming that we aren't who we say we are. And so there are these exceptionalities to marriage. It's not as secure as you might think if you look at the legal history of transgender marriage particularly. So marriage has not made trans people more secure, and you might wonder, given our current circumstances, what might the LGBT movement have learned about marriage if those activists had paid attention to what was happening to trans people? It's like, is this a good priority for us if these things can be challenged and taken away any old time? And then why didn't that happen? Why didn't gay and lesbian activists go seeking out what was happening to trans people and looking at how marriage was practiced in trans communities? So to really explore these questions today, I have to talk to you about, of all things, the AIDS crisis, its causes, and its impact on gay politics. Why is the AIDS crisis, which immediately preceded the emergence of marriage equality as a mainstream gay rights goal, so rarely discussed in relationship to marriage equality discourses? Why is marriage equality ahistoricized as having always existed as an idea, while AIDS is erased as having never happened? How does this keep us from seeing the AIDS crisis and marriage equality as two outcomes of the same political realignment that has occurred during the age of Reagan, which many political theorists argue we have really never left behind? These questions lead me to an even bigger question that I hope becomes easier to ask in the wake of Obergefell, as we experience the creeping realization that no, marriage does not make us equal, and that perhaps equality was the wrong goal all along. That question is, neoliberalism, what is it? The answer is that neoliberalism doesn't want you to be able to answer this question, which is why it's so hard to answer. Not being able to ask a question is evidence of an unseen force. Queer theorist Eve Sedgwick makes this crucial point about how silence is a form of power in the epistemology of the closet when she writes that, silence is rendered as pointed and is performative as speech. By not saying something, silence does something. It is not just an absence, but an action of not acting. As I often tell students in my courses, the nothing is a something. Another question we could ask is, why was AIDS forgotten? The answer to that question is complex, but I will suggest today that remembering AIDS, being cognizant of AIDS as a global health crisis that was permitted to occur and that has killed nearly 39 million people since 1981, would have demanded a larger coming to terms with the brutal global consequences of neoliberalism, which the developed world wishes to naturalize and erase. The shift to economic liberalism, free markets, and privatization of public goods was normalized through an ideology that conservative British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher called TINA. There is no alternative. In what ways have we too adopted this ideology in our own movement politics? Acknowledging AIDS would mean acknowledging the direct and brutal effects of our modern global economy and our complicity in these deaths. This is a story that marriage equality doesn't tell. So today, I'll try to connect these lost histories and their political effects to this odd moment of equality after Obergefell that remains so clearly saturated with anti-poor, anti-black, and anti-trans violence. So, back to the impossible question. Neoliberalism. WTF. In the early 1980s, US and European economic and social policy shifted to shrink the state, privatize all public resources, and reorder the entirety of cultural life along capitalist management rationalities. Profit became the only public good the state could pursue, and citizens were increasingly expected to manage their lives as if they were investment portfolios. The state suddenly and dramatically began to disabuse itself of any responsibility to ensure a basic quality of life as a guarantee of citizenship or humanity. This had tremendous impacts on vulnerable populations. Prisons exploded, unions failed, healthcare was privatized into HMOs, welfare was defunded under welfare reform and dismantled, and stable working class jobs began to vanish. In an attempt to pacify these newly disenfranchised and precaritized populations, the state offered some previously dissident social groups new roles as assimilated minority consumer groups under the neoliberal political reframing. As Lisa Duggan brilliantly illustrates in The Twilight of Equality, these groups were offered inclusion while others were not, in an attempt to fragment and divide the powerful left-wing coalitions that had emerged in the 1960s and 70s. This inclusion was a new long-term strategy employed after the state had fought protracted internal and external wars against many of the resistant social movements of this revolutionary period. This violent eradication was then claimed as evidence that radical social movements do not work. Assimilation to neoliberal capital through identity politics, not populist socialism, was the tool that would purportedly give us equality. In the first decade of the neoliberal restructuring, there was a great forgetting of the tactics used and the gains won by radical political movements of the 1930s through the 1970s, and also a great forgetting of the crises produced by this restructuring, including AIDS. AIDS was perhaps the first great extinction threat produced by neoliberalism. The second is arguably climate change. These emerged simultaneously as crises, at precisely the moment at which the US state began to disestablish any responsibility to maintain the environmental commons or the public health of the population. AIDS was permitted to become a crisis precisely because those who acquired it already belonged to devalued social groups, and because the virus was contracted through an apparent inability to rationally manage one's illicit desires. Under neoliberal logic, people who acquired AIDS deserved the consequences of their bad investments in gay sex and drug use. It is no simple coincidence that this period, and we're talking roughly late 70s to mid 80s, also marked the re-legalization of the death penalty and the explosion of the prison industrial complex along similarly rationalizing assumptions. Under neoliberalism, those who make poor choices and fail to govern their behavior rationally do not deserve rights, life chances, or life itself. Viewing the AIDS crisis as the result of neoliberal expectations that we manage our bodies rationally and adopt personal practices of risk aversion in place of the state's guarantees to a social safety net can help us begin to see why marriage might have emerged in the wake of AIDS crisis as a new movement goal. While much anti-gay discourse during the AIDS crisis marshaled conservative, religious rhetoric against queer and trans communities, these attacks were actually useful and encouraged only to the extent that they fundamentally supported neoliberal policy. Queer and trans populations were vilified and allowed to die precisely because their experimental, oppositional cultures were incompatible with the profit motive of global capital. For example, in The Gentrification of the Mind, Sarah Schulman establishes a relationship between AIDS deaths in New York City and the homogenizing effects of gentrification in previously radical gay enclaves, illustrating how the disease emptied real estate occupied by queer artists, writers, and radicals that then could be increased to market rate prices and sold to white bourgeois heterosexual couples. AIDS also did the work of clearing many communities of the transgender sex workers that gentrifying cities wished to remove from the urban environments that white middle-class populations were relocating from the suburbs to fill. Samuel R. Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue is a trenchant record of the gentrifying effects of the new anti-porn and anti-sex work discourses, which were produced by an unholy alliance between feminists and the right wing, that were used to clean up Times Square in the mid-1990s. What was for Delaney in the 1970s a space of cross-class queer intimacy and sexual democracy, Times Square is now owned by private corporate interests and designed entirely to capture tourist dollars. Because those who lived in alternative sexual arrangements, who used drugs, and who had less money were more likely to contract the virus, AIDS had a stultifying effect on the LGBTQ political imagination. To understand the political effects of AIDS, you have to understand that it was the radicals, the artists, and the poor who largely died, and that this dying was profitable in terms of real estate development, zoning, and corporate privatization of urban public space. To understand the political effects of AIDS, you also have to ask, who assumed leadership of the movement once these radical communities were gone? What were the new priorities? And how did those priorities become our priorities? What did we forget? And then how did we forget this forgetting? In the 30 years since the beginning of AIDS, the LGBT movement has been focused nearly entirely on reversing the homophobic legislation of one decade, the decade between 1986 and 1996. These changes were demanded through a religious, right-wing rhetoric that the state chose to legitimize as political speech, precisely because this speech had valuable neoliberal effects. Consider these patterns, okay? So let's talk about official movement history. I like to call this what happened, but in scare quotes. In 1986, Bowers v. Hardwick, we get a Supreme Court ruling that says using sodomy laws to punish gay people is constitutionally sound. So sodomy laws went up against trial, and they weren't overturned, they were upheld. This ruling was reversed in 2003 by Lawrence v. Texas, which struck all sodomy laws off the books in the United States. Then, in 1987, we have the Helms Amendment, which is it's an attachment to appropriations funding bill that illegalized travel to the US by people with HIV-positive status. This was reversed in 2009 by an executive order. 1993, we have the passage of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which banned open gay, lesbian, and bisexual military service in the United States. Previously to this, gay soldiers could not serve at all. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a sort of triangulation strategy where you could serve, but you could never be out as gay, lesbian, or bi. This was, of course, lifted by an executive order in 2010. And then in 1996, we have DOMA, or the Defense of Marriage Act, which made gay marriage illegal at the federal level and said that no state needed to recognize gay marriages from other states. And we just superseded this rule entirely, finally, all sections of it, in Obergefell. So notice how we have the corrections to the law follow the pathway that they were initially set up, right? We've been chasing this homophobic rhetoric that was written into our legislation for 30 years, basically. This should be a familiar story to you, but I think we don't often think about how it's connected to the AIDS crisis, that this legislation all pops up in the decade when the AIDS crisis was at its height in the US. and before we had good treatments for it. Let's also talk about unofficial movement history, and I call this mischances. These are the things we don't talk about. 1973, homosexuality is removed from the Diagnostic Statistic Manual of the American Psychological Association. Gay people are no longer considered mentally ill, no longer medically stigmatized. Roe v. Wade also passes that year. So we have big victories for cisgender gay and lesbian people and for feminists. I call this the break, because what happens afterward? 1976, the death penalty is reinstated. This is never overturned. 1980, transsexuality is added to the DSM as a new class of mental illness. This is never overturned entirely. 1981, transsexuality is excluded from treatment under Medicaid. This is never overturned. 1985, the gay blood ban is instated by the FDA. This is a rule that says gay men can't donate blood. Notice how this is also connected to the AIDS crisis and HIV panic. This is not overturned. 1994, the first trans-exclusionary ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which at this point only protected gay and lesbian people, was introduced to the Senate and failed, and has never been passed. And in 2007, the first trans-inclusive agenda was introduced to the Senate and has never passed. So what can we learn from these patterns? Since 1986, I think, the first rule is efforts to combat queer oppression have been centered entirely on overcoming stigmas about gay men that were written into legislation during the AIDS crisis. We often don't think about it that way. We think of queer inequality as just kind of existing ahistorically in our culture. But a lot of what we've been doing is undoing stuff that happened during the AIDS crisis. We finally finished, kind of, with that, although the blood ban is still there, right? So that kind of pushback against legislation that's targeting just one part of the community tends to privilege that part of the community. The discourse most relied upon to do this pushback is a narrative of homonormative assimilation to heteronormative social structures. And so this is where marriage comes along as. We can be just like you, we can blend in, we'll privatize our sexuality, right? Those kinds of claims were used to kind of destigmatize gay sex, destigmatize gay bodies. Gay people wanted to become normal. That was the dominant mainstream discourse at the time. Third point we can take away, the strategies for the normalization of gay citizenship have been, 1, privatization of queer sexuality and queer social life, and 2, capitulation to consumer capitalism as the major mode of participation in culture. Anyone who goes to a pride parade knows that the floats are sponsored by, Absolute Vodka, banks, all kinds of corporations have a really high stake in the rhetoric of pride. And we're encouraged to buy things and not make political demands. That's like the new face of pride. And the fourth point, the movement has fractured. Like, look at this, look at where we fractured in 1973. The movement has fractured along lines of criminalization, medical stigma, and gender normativity in ways that actually endorse anti-AIDS discourse, but direct it away from LGBT people and toward transgender populations. So there's a pushing down of the stigma we let the stigma continue, but we push it away from cisgender, gay, and lesbian people, and we allow it to still exist over in the trans community. We allow the trans people to become the new bad guy, basically. Thus, by 2011, we arrive at the homonormative movement that in his book Normal Life, trans legal theorist Dean Spade calls LGB fake tea. It's important to notice how mainstream LGBT activists and organizations chose to argue against the homophobic legislation of the AIDS crisis, period, by marshaling claims of homonormativity and homonationalism. Gay people are American citizens, we belong. The AIDS quilt, the largest piece of art memorializing the AIDS crisis, was designed by Cleve Jones particularly with this value statement in mind, that gay people are also Americans, also from the middle of the country, also middle class, and also belong to families and therefore also to America. These rhetorical strategies would come to typify the discourse of modern gay rights as an assimilative politics. What I'd like you to notice here is that these values, which would give us marriage equality as the centralized movement objective by the mid-1990s, are apparent at least 5 years earlier in the movement's response to AIDS. Of course, the shift did not emerge unopposed. Radical activist groups such as ACT UP publicly repudiated the quilt as passive and apolitical, critiques that would also later solidify against the prioritization of marriage as the movement's single-issue goal. ACT UP's direct action response to the quilt, the 1992 Ashes Action, in which ACT UP activists scattered the ashes of their dead loved ones on the White House lawn, marking it as a graveyard, was ephemeral in ways that ask us to think about how radical embodied resistance does not necessarily lend itself to memorialization. Acts of institutionalized memorialization, such as the quilt, often require a simplification, a loss of histories less easily captured or less compatible with national ideology. As such, the quilt institutes a forgetting, or a literal covering over of the more radical demands on the nation in response to AIDS, particularly by ACT UP, whose actions to speed up drug trials and approval and bring down the cost of AIDS drugs actually saved lives. Understanding the effects of the shift that occurred during the crisis, that this forgetting of the radical legacies of queer liberation that happened along with the denial of AIDS as a historical event, helps us also to understand why marriage emerges during this time of restructuring as the apparent solution to queer inequality, which had come to be dominated by xenophobic and religious right-wing responses to AIDS. Marriage as a goal offers an alliance with the privatizing logic of neoliberalism, but it also contains an appeal to the shrinking embattled state for protection from the virulently homophobic rhetoric and policy that had been licensed by the state as speech. What the push for marriage failed to understand is that both sides of this conflict actually stem from the same set of power relations, in which appeals to the state for protection can never be secured because the state has surreptitiously absolved itself of this very function. In fact, these appeals only embed the movement more deeply in collusion with the neoliberal restructuring of our society. Marriage is a driver of, not a resolution of inequality, fragmenting queer and trans communities along class and gender normative lines. This is how we arrive at an equality politics that can never achieve what it claims to pursue, which then increases our investment in its empty promises. Queer of color theorist Sarah Ahmed calls this process national love. The nation secures our loving investment in its promise of equality precisely by withholding it. Many people respond to these critiques of marriage as if they're mean-spirited. Why, they argue, can't queer and trans activists just let people be in love and enjoy their new rights? Why can't we view marriage simply as a good step in the longer struggle to secure rights for everyone? Why must queer and trans anti-marriage activists continue to be such killjoys? These responses tend to overlook the very real and deadly consequences of a politics that can only imagine equality through an assimilation strategy that privileges the most normal LGBTQ people. Current LGBT politics allow us to overlook the escalating level of transgender death in our culture as unrelated to the last 20 years of marriage equality rhetoric. These responses also ask people who experienced the AIDS crisis, who lost loved ones and friends to medical neglect and government inaction, to accept marriage as a substitute for any real cultural reckoning with the trauma of this forgotten period. We need to start thinking of the shift to prioritize marriage in the 1990s as a response to the unacknowledged and cultural trauma and mass death of AIDS. As long as AIDS remains forgotten, as long as we refuse to deal with how the state deemed and continues to deem queer and trans deaths permissible, we will be unable to understand why we keep dying, despite our shiny new marriage licenses. What has it done to our political imagination to be prevented from mourning AIDS? What has it done to our political imagination to have the AIDS crisis disappeared, as though the deaths of 500,000 Americans did not happen? As though these deaths are still not happening? How has this normalized for us a politics that allows the loss of unrecognized lives? I return to Sarah Schulman in Gentrification of the Mind. 81,542 people have died of AIDS in New York City as of August 16, 2008. These people, our friends, are rarely mentioned. Their absence is not computed, and the meaning of their loss is not considered. No one was ever made accountable. Where is our permanent memorial? Not the AIDS quilt, now locked up in storage somewhere, but the government-sponsored invitation to mourn and understand, equal to Maya Lin's memorial to the dead in Vietnam. Where is our wall of white marble with the names of every dead New Yorker who died of government neglect, and blank tablets with room for more to come, surrounding a white marble fountain spouting water the color of blood? Where is our federal aid to survivors and damaged communities? Where is our catharsis, our healing? Where is our post-traumatic stress diagnosis? Where is our recovery? In 1996, after the invention of the protease cocktail that started to slow some people's deaths from HIV, a treatment that was the result of 15 years of direct action by radical queer groups, a disturbing quiet settled over the movement. Hundreds of AIDS activists were dead. Hundreds of queer and trans artists and thinkers were dead. Into this void emerged a new set of gay leaders with a new agenda. Andrew Sullivan, a conservative Catholic gay intellectual, and perhaps the most recognized of this group, wrote a best-selling 1995 book titled Virtually Normal, in which he claimed that once we had achieved rights to gay military service and gay marriage, quote, we should have a party and close down the gay rights movement for good, unquote. Sullivan, an HIV-positive gay man who was never a part of ACT UP, but who survived the crisis due to ACT UP's work, quickly ascended into a mainstream position of authority on gay issues. On November 10, 1996, a column by Sullivan appeared in the New York Times, a paper that ACT UP had initially forced to cover the AIDS crisis, in which he claimed that we had reached, quote, the end of AIDS. You know, one awesome thing I learned doing research for this paper is that one of the first actions that ACT UP used against the New York Times when they found out the New York Times had gotten a fax machine, this is how far back we're talking, and people didn't have fax machines. The first thing that ACT UP did was fax the New York Times a mile of black paper. Pretty awesome. So I'd like to note here how understanding our history, encapsulated in the figure of Sullivan, helps us see how the invention of marriage equality as a solution to queer inequality necessitated the simultaneous forgetting of AIDS. They come from the same place. In some ways, we did this to ourselves because we did not want to acknowledge what had been done to us. Perhaps because with the devastating loss of our artistic, intellectual, and literary communities, we had very few ways to make sense of our trauma. However, the new priorities represented by Sullivan and others were not unopposed, as we are commonly led to believe. Gay playwright Tony Kushner, whose play Angels in America stands as gay literature's definitive treatment of the AIDS crisis, publicly answered Sullivan's claims in an essay for The Nation titled A Socialism of the Skin. In this essay, which has largely slipped into historical obscurity, Kushner warned, "It is entirely conceivable that we will one day live miserably in a thoroughly ravaged world in which lesbians and gay men can marry and serve openly in the army, and that's it." I find this warning remarkably prescient for our own time, in which a central linchpin of LGBT politics, marriage equality, has recently been achieved. Not since the release of the protease cocktail and the cessation of queer mass death from AIDS has the movement experienced such a resounding political victory. I would ask us today to think about what happens after such victories. The title of this talk, What Now?, is about that question. What now do we ask for? What do we do? I want to return to these faces, these bodies, these lives, and ask you to think about what it means to demand the impossible. Where is the movement that would make these deaths mournable? Make them a part of our history. Place them at the center of our political imagination. And here, I'd like to revisit Schulman, but with a twist. 22 transgender people have been murdered this year in the United States as of November 17, 2015. These people, our friends, are rarely mentioned. Their absence is not computed, and the meaning of their loss is not considered. No one has been made accountable. Where is our permanent memorial? Not Transgender Day of Remembrance, but the movement-sponsored invitation to mourn and understand. Where is our wall of white marble with the names of every dead transgender person who has died from political neglect, from denial of healthcare and housing, from transphobic violence, and blank tablets with room for more to come, surrounding a white marble fountain spouting water the color of blood. Where is our federal aid to survivors and damaged communities? Where is our catharsis, our healing? Where is our post-traumatic stress diagnosis? Where is our recovery? It's hard to ask these questions because there are many invisible forces that wish us not to ask. Some of these forces are outside of us, and some of these forces are inside of us. This is why our history is so important, why it can mean the difference between life and death. The erasure of AIDS means the erasure of the fierce brilliance of AIDS activism. Those activists were indeed asking for the impossible, and for 15 years, they struggled against a death sentence to make the impossible real. Most died before the impossibility they demanded became possible. Others live on in a country that denies what happened to them was ever real to begin with. If we are to demand the impossible now, we need to claw back this legacy, to reckon with how its loss might have led us astray. It can be terrifying to look deeply at a thoroughly ravaged world that we never asked to inherit. In not looking, however, the impossible is also never demanded. We will believe the lie that the work is too hard, too risky, that no one is brave enough or strong enough to bear the load. We will believe that we are alone, that no one has ever faced what we face. We will lose the ability to ask, what world do we want to live in? Thank you.